California.
Okay. I'm trying to think where Martinez is.
Well, do you know where Walnut Creek is?
I do.
Concord.
Sure.
It's in that area.
Okay, all right.
It's about 30 miles east of San
Okay.
Francisco.
So it's about 2 hours during traffic.
Good morning. Welcome to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School on a beautiful Sabbath morning in Southern California. We've had our winds, and when we have our winds, it blows the smog away from us. So now it's just gorgeous. So we hope you're enjoying your Sabbaths wherever you are as much as we get to today. I thought I'd read from the first Psalm, and it's about the law. And the reason I'm reading it is that I've become aware that those who are interested in Metamodernism have become somewhat disenchanted with the laissez-faire attitude toward law and structure and meaning and purpose that was so prevalent amongst some forms of postmodernism. So there's a desire to get something that will be more helpful, it is said, particularly in this time of crisis, climate crisis, financial crisis, and so forth, political crisis. And the observation of some is that
Larson talking.
The casual attitude toward things such as truth and right and wrong that characterizes some forms of postmodernism really is not helpful in these very, very stressing times. So very young people are turning back to find more law, more structure, more concern with truth and error, and good and bad, right and wrong. So it's a very interesting development. Now, in the history of Christian thought, the relationship between the law and the gospel has been an interesting one. The Lutheran tradition has made a sharp distinction between law and gospel and said that the law always comes first as the bad news, which prepares us for the good news of the gospel. So they will talk about two purposes of the law: the purpose to drive us into an awareness of our sinfulness and also to restrain disorder in society. But those of us who descend from Calvin add a third use of the law, and that is, in addition to restraining evil and bringing us awareness of our own sinfulness, the law provides guidance, positive guidance for our lives. The most fascinating expression of this is the 20th century theologian Karl Barth, who Calvinist theologian, right? On his wall, he had a picture of Mozart and Calvin, those two. And he said the angels play Mozart when they can, but when God's around, they have to play Bach. But anyway, he had a good time, and he said that, the gospel comes to us in the form of law. Now that's an interesting way to put it. The gospel comes to us in the form of law. It's not law and gospel, not law or gospel, but the law is the gospel. That's much more like what we'll read here. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of the scoffers. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its seasons. And their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So let's begin with prayer. Dear God, again, we are thankful for all of this technology from the enlightenment of all things that makes it possible for us to communicate with each other. Help us to get a measured view of the enlightenment, not too optimistic, but then not too pessimistic either. Help us all to also to have a balanced view on this business of law. We know that for many Adventists, the law has been a blessing because it's given them structure and purpose, meaning and direction. But for many other Adventists, the law has been a crushing burden that has robbed them of the assurance of their salvation. So we need to find some way to be helpful to everyone in our community of faith. We need your guidance in how to do that, and we pray for it. In Christ's name, amen. Now, we have Matthew Korpman back with us today, thankfully. Hi, Matthew. We're going to have to ask you to unmute yourself. There we go.
Thank you so much for having me again.
The original thought was that maybe Matthew would talk about the second half of his book today, just as he earlier talked about the first half. But I was able to persuade him to put that off till February, when we can take a look at each of the chapters, or at least several of the chapters in the second part of his book, rather than dealing with the whole second part of his book on one occasion. This also gives us a chance to look at the issue of Metamodernism, about which Matthew is more informed than I. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. We've agreed that this might be more of a conversation than a formal lecture on his part. Let's see where Matthew takes us. But I am fascinated that I know something about pre-modernism and modernism and postmodernism. I know 1 week's worth about metamodernism, and in 1 week, one doesn't learn that much. So take it away, Matthew.
Thank you so much. No, you're right. You don't learn a lot in a week or even any amount of time. And that's partly because there's very little written about it. It is something that, like postmodernism, when it started, was happening in the arts, was happening in the culture. It took a while before there were philosophers who started to think through the ramifications of it and then actually shape it into something that then reshaped the developing culture. So metamodernism, in a sense, is something that, strangely enough, we probably already are experiencing in different ways, but we don't yet understand it because it's affecting the culture. It's probably the younger people more than anyone are starting to symbolize it in their culture. But it's something that is yet to have philosophy really dig down deep into it. I'll be occasionally referencing, I think, this book that I have on my iPad here, Lena Rachel Anderson's book, Metamodernity. If you want, it doesn't matter, you guys are great because you've done a whole series of classes on postmodernism, but even if you hadn't, this book is written for people who may not have any background in these philosophical worldviews, but it's the only, and I think the first true philosophic work to try and tackle what does metamodernity look like. So it's called Metamodernity, Meaning and Hope in a Complex World. It's from Denmark. It's from a think tank group that wants to promote metamodernism that's located in Denmark by Lena, L-E-N-E, Rachel Anderson. So Metamodernity. Get the book if you have any interest in this. Now, metamodernism, because this is a very new book and it's probably one of the first attempts to really try to deal with this topic. There have been a few other works that have tried to touch on metamodernism, but they're touching on it in regards to the arts and so forth. There are currently no works on metamodernism that affect theology currently. I myself am trying to write one, and I'm sure there's others who may, but no one knows about them. So, they'll pop up when they do. But part of the issue is, again, metamodernism as a phrase isn't even a phrase everyone agrees on. Some people call it postmodernism. There's a bunch of different names people come up with it. It's really just to say that people who are advocating for a beyond postmodernism are, in a sense, advocating that what we're talking about here in regards to in regards to metamodernity is something that tells us that postmodernism isn't enough. It cannot be the end stage, and it cannot even be, this is a further claim that Anderson does a good job of pointing out, that philosophically speaking, we cannot even defensively speak of postmodernity. That in fact, Anderson's claim is that right now, we cannot say we live in postmodernity because postmodernity is an oxymoron. It is impossible by the nature of what postmodernism is. So in other words, we live in a modernity utilizing hermeneutical principles from postmodernism that are deconstructing modernism and leaving us with nothing. That is not to say that we're going to criticize postmodernism. Anderson does not criticize postmodernism. Instead, what postmodernism is like a special pair of eyeglasses that we've developed to allow us to look backwards, as Anderson says, and see everything that came before. In other words, without postmodernism, we wouldn't even realize the flaws in the Enlightenment. Without postmodernism, we would not be able to recognize the issues inherent in the many worldviews before. But postmodernism undermines itself. It critiques its own system. And so the problem with essentially what we would think of as a, how would you say it? When we say modernity, pre-modernity, when we talk about the ITY, the ITY at the end, we're talking about a stable system that provides meaning and values and allows people to conceive the world in a holistic way. But postmodernism does not allow for that, precisely because in its current form, deconstruction simply deconstructs. It is not interested in reconstruction. It's interested in basically demonstrating how every structure that looks solid is in fact fluid. Now that is good in the sense that it's truthful. What postmodernism shows us is right and gives us evidence of things that we were blind to. What it's not helpful for is forming a society, giving values, creating a system that can last beyond itself. It's a tool, not a system. It undermines systems. It gives clarity, but it doesn't give stability. As such, it cannot become postmodernity because a postmodernity is an oxymoron. It would destroy every other worldview before it, according to Anderson and others in this kind of thinking. It would undermine where everything that you want to claim would be undone. Now, a lot of people who claim or believe a lot of things that have been informed through postmodernism, and I'm speaking just culturally, not like, philosophically, they've gone and studied this. The average population, say in the United States, you can already see to a certain degree that postmodernism is failing in the sense that some of the people who have been the most affected by it have regressed to modernism for issues that postmodernism would not get them the desired result. So for example, take, let's say, the issue of race. The conflicts and debates on race for social justice warriors, SJW, and I'm using this term not in a negative, but just to simply refer to those very active activists who are engaged in racial politics and in a whole host of discussions that are going to probably shape much of the vocabulary that go forward in the next 10 years. Those individuals are very strongly postmodern and relativistic in lots of areas. But when it comes to race, postmodernism does not give them the answer they want. Postmodernism essentially would deconstruct their anti-racism. Postmodernism would leave them in a loop, constantly demonstrating how every attempt they try to undermine racism is really an attempt to continue it. It does not give them social change. It does not provide the ability for them to end up in anything but a potential nihilistic despair on trying to achieve their change, and at least how it's popularly conceived by them. So as a result, many of those who are on that issue, though they be relativistic in almost every other respect, revert to modernism when they are dealing with race. Now there are absolute good and evil. There is an absolute right and wrong. In fact, some theologians and philosophers have talked about how modern anti-racism theories have at times with certain individuals seem to mirror early, Christian concepts of original sin. Very closely resemble a religious kind of atmosphere that resembles pre-modernism sometimes. And what it's demonstrating is that postmodernism gave the ability to deconstruct, but not construct. And that causes a problem when you have social movements that want to create new things, but the tools they've been given only deconstruct. What they end up doing is reverting back haphazardly, not logically, to an earlier worldview that allowed them to speak in the way that they're doing, while simultaneously having no foundation for doing so, given the other views that they currently hold. Now, this is not metamodernism, but some people have wondered if it was. So sometimes you'll read metamodernism discussed as an oscillation, constantly going back and forth between two positions. And sometimes this has been used as a critique early on of this emerging phenomenon to argue that, well, can't you see it's not very logical? In a sense, it's like a pick and choose buffet, all right? I got postmodern beliefs, but I'm going to choose that I want modernism today for this issue, and I'll use relativism for this issue. That's not really metamodernism, in my opinion. Now, mind you, you need to keep this in understanding. Because metamodernism is an idea that is emerging, it means that there is no expert on it, because it doesn't exist yet. It's not solidified. It's not a thing that you can point to and go, okay, it is a developing field, developing worldview, developing both outside of any scholarly perspective on it in the culture, but developing within scholarship. So that means that I'm giving you my perspective on it, or I'm giving you Anderson's perspective on it, but there may very well be another metamodern philosopher analysis that comes out that would disagree. In my view, from what I've studied so far, and mind you, again, I'm a biblical scholar. My PhD is in New Testament. I am not going ahead and getting to take multitudes of classes on philosophy. So I do this in my spare time out of love for the field and love for the interest. So in that respect, there's probably tons of holes in my knowledge. But luckily, metamodernism is a very small field currently, so you can get a lot of knowledge pretty quickly. And I love postmodern theology and studying things, so I piece stuff together best as I can. But keep that in mind in all humility. Given this, in my opinion, that kind of phenomenon of an oscillation constantly going back and forth is more of a description of the dysfunctionality of postmodernism and its inability to give reconstruction. It's not really what metamodernism is going to be. That should be something more stable. Metamodernism has to become metamodernity. You can't have a new stability that's based on just pick and choose going back and forth. That just doesn't seem like it really moved that far from postmodernism. So the idea of metamodernism becomes this concept of how can it be that there can in fact be things that are right and wrong or true and false, things that you can grab onto, while at the same time affirming everything postmodernism has taught us in humility about the structure of reality and the fluidity of all these topics. How can you reach that middle ground? Now, the way that I would say it should be is that the way I would argue it, this is me, is that Jacques Derrida, who I suspect you've all gotten to some degree to know in these classes, at least his name must have been used, or deconstruction has been used, that famous phrase. I believe that Jacques Derrida, in his early formulations that shaped postmodern discourse, actually held the key in one of his essays to metamodernism. And I should also note that Jacques Derrida never agreed fully with the way in which his works were used for postmodernism. He often critiqued that people did not understand his concept of deconstruction and that they were using it haphazardly, and that annoyed him. And in fact, I'd agree. Deconstruction has too often been utilized as a concept for basically just undermining everything. But it was part of a larger concept that Derrida had that in fact involved reconstruction. Now, Derrida, of course, is emerging with postmodernism. They're just learning how to use these eyeglasses. So guess what happens when you start to see things clearly? You see everything and you notice how it's all different from how you thought it was, because now you have clarity. There might be lots of other stuff you could focus on, but now you're more focused on the fact that it wasn't it wasn't like how you thought it was. So Derrida has this article, and I intended to get it out and emailed to you before the class, but I wasn't able to because of circumstances. I'll be sure to give a copy of the article to Dr. Larson so he can mail it out and you can see it. But basically, Derrida wrote an article on law and justice. And it's a brilliant article, foundational for Derrida's work, I think, in thinking about deconstruction, and points us towards both what postmodernism really is and what metamodernism has to be. And shows us that postmodernism held in Derrida's own writings its own birth, even in the birth of postmodernism. So here's how it goes in terms of the Law and Justice article. To understand deconstruction, you have to know two terms. One is the deconstructible. What is three terms: the constructed, the deconstructed, and the undeconstructible. So things that are constructed, things that are deconstructed, and the things that are undeconstructible. You could never deconstruct them. And sometimes people never hear about this third term, this idea of something Derrida said that could never be deconstructed. The way it works is, and I'm going to try to tie this into our religious vocabulary as well. The way it works is that something that is deconstructed is essentially something that had to be constructed. It cannot be deconstructed unless it was first constructed. Only if someone had to build it can it be unbuilt. In this sense, then, something that is deconstructible is something that is always tangible, always temporal, always something within a context. It is something that relies on other factors in order to exist. Something that is undeconstructible is something that does not rely upon anything to exist, does not need anything to exist, exists no matter what outside space and time. More importantly, because it exists outside space and time, it does not technically exist. It is not a thing. And because it's not a thing and it doesn't exist in the sense that we do, it cannot be deconstructed. These are as close to what we would call eternal things as Derrida gets to. So now, the undeconstructible, as this is understood in his article, applies, for example, to the idea of justice. Justice, Derrida argues, is something that is in fact not real. There is nothing we can point to that is just. There is nothing that we can say and go, that is 100% justice. Rather, justice is something which is an ideal, which does not in fact exist, and yet, despite not existing, we all seem to hear its echo, its haunting call that calls upon us to enact it. So justice as the undeconstructible calls on people to enact and to approximate what justice should be in time and space. Now, at that point, as we hear the call for justice, Derrida says, we create laws. As we create laws, what ends up happening is that we are trying to approximate justice in the law. But that law was created. It was constructed in the light of the undeconstructible justice's call. But the law is not justice. The law is constructed, which means it's deconstructible. Something that was created as a law at one point in time for approximating justice may become 100, 200 years later under different circumstances an unjust law, something that in fact hurts other people and does the opposite of what its intentions were. This is why Derrida says, and others, why law courts have to constantly review, the judges have to review all of court precedent, all of the legal arguments, because the law is always changing. It is always adjusting to new circumstances. It is trying to approximate justice, and the law itself is never that. It is always something approximating, thus always deconstructed. Now, here's where it ties in with religious language too. What happens if you think that that law that is deconstructible, that was constructed by humans, is actually justice? What happens when justice is mistaken for something constructed? It is at that moment in which you have mistaken something constructed for the undeconstructible that you have created an idol. It is at that moment that we come close to religious language. We are looking at an idol that claims to represent eternity, but is in fact as temporal as it gets. So what do idols need? They need to be deconstructed. So the idea of deconstruction is the necessity of how idols must be broken, how things we think are so given and solid must be demonstrated for what they always were, which was something we created. Now, having said that, if my thought doesn't leave me now, because it was right on the tip of my tongue. Dang, I hate this. I've been having this happen a few times. The main point or the idea of the deconstruction in relation to the undeconstructible is to recognize that the deconstructed element that we are looking at is not something we deconstruct. People, again, this is another idea that people miss. They talk about like, I am doing a deconstruction. I'm undertaking a deconstruction. That's not how it works. Derrida says we don't actually choose to deconstruct. Deconstruction occurs automatically. It is not something we must engage or start. It happens automatically. And it happens by virtue of, in a sense, a contradiction. It's when you realize that, even subconsciously, that something you believe and something in front of you don't match, your brain's already beginning a process of deconstruction. By the time you notice it, it's been going on. You are just finally catching up to the ride. But this is, in a sense, where postmodernism took us, is looking at that whole process of deconstruction, noticing the idol, smashing it, or noticing how it gets smashed, paying attention to that, giving us a critiquing tool. But notice what postmodernism has failed to take into account of what Derrida spoke of: the undeconstructible, the call, the creation. These elements have not been picked up on in postmodernism because, again, they're more reminiscent with modernity, and postmodernism's critiques help to change modernity. But nonetheless, the idea of reconstruction, the fact that a law is deconstructed and always reconstructed, the fact that the call is incessant and never ends, the fact that the laws must still come to existence to approximate the justice, despite the fact that they never will. This process, the creative process, is what postmodernism has never looked at, has not given, or not never, but in the large role, has not chosen to give focus to. It has honed its critiques, but it has not yet given adequate attention to Derrida's other part of the scheme, how things are created and how that call exists. Now, some scholars have begun to do some work in this regard, still very firmly in the postmodern sense. John Caputo is probably one of the most famous ones. He's a famous philosopher / theologian, postmodern theologian, who loves Derrida and tries to think through how Derrida is, understood. If you haven't read it, great book. I think actually it was mentioned in one of the classes, if I'm not mistaken. What would Jesus deconstruct? Great book. Wonderful. If you have not read What Would Jesus Deconstruct by John Caputo, you don't understand postmodernism as well as you should. That is a really important book to see postmodern theology and how it works. But Caputo's argument would be that just like justice is undeconstructible, God is undeconstructible. So that we can see that the same kind of phenomenon which we're looking at in law and justice occurs with God and scripture, God and humans. And you can get the same thing. God is that which does not exist in our space and time, is that which transcends a creation of our own, is that which is undeconstructible. So Caputo wants to create that kind of scenario so that he can say something like, he likes these quippy statements, but one of the ones he's most famous for is to say, God does not exist, God insists. And hopefully now that after I went ahead and said, what I did, it makes sense what he's trying to say. God does not exist. He's not a thing we created that is in our reality, space and time. God insists. He's like justice. He's that undeconstructible thing that calls upon us, and we hear it nonetheless, and we respond. Now, Caputo, however, is firmly still postmodern. And so Caputo's works and his theology of what he calls the unconditional, that's how he likes to call God, the unconditional, the thing that's not conditioned by anything. But his idea of God as an unconditional thing tends to go in directions that can be quite postmodern, in the sense that he can't really say much about the unconditional. In a sense, at the end of his book, The Folly of God, if you want to read an example of what his theology, a postmodern theology, could lead you to, read The Folly of God by John Caputo. I do suggest you read What Would Jesus Deconstruct first. But The Folly of God's a thin little book, and I tell you, I was depressed at the end of it. It is a solemn view that he comes up with, in which essentially the end message is that the unconditional God is really equivalent to potentiality, potential, and how potential is always on the horizon, and it could kill us all, or it could love us all. It could give us blessing, or it could destroy us all. And that's the best we can say, the unconditional. It's a very uninspiring for me kind of ending, but it's fascinating how he gets there, and using Derrida's works and stuff to kind of feed into it. But it's still postmodern, what he's doing. He can't bring himself to really come to a point of saying God is this, or I can affirm this thing, I can affirm that thing, because in the end, he can't. Postmodernism critiques and undermines. So this is the system he's creating. But nonetheless, Caputo offers much for anyone who's going to think metamodernly. And he will always be, I suspect, for the next 100 years, someone who's going to be read and studied in relation to Derrida. But in that respect, metamodernism goes beyond this, in the sense that we are looking for that creative element. In other words, the laws are real, and Derrida does affirm they do approximate justice. Right? Derrida is not interested in trying to dispute that our approximations are pointing towards and are a response to justice. They just never are justice, so they're always going to fail. Now, this is not a strange concept for Christians, right? And in the Bible, we have, in many sense, right, gone ahead and always talked about, right? Like, okay, let's think of several scenarios here. Paul wants to talk to us about the fact that the kingdom of God is now, and yet it's not yet. We are already in the kingdom of God, and yet it is still to happen. Right? This in-between is very much in the kind of idea of what we're describing with Derrida's system here. Yes, it is a law that approximates justice. No, it cannot be confused with justice, and in fact, it fails miserably. There is this sense in which this is the kingdom of God, and yet no, it's a hellish prison. Oh my goodness, God save us all. There is this in-between, this tension between the two, while not negating either. This is what Derrida is pointing us to with Law and Justice. He's pointing us to this middle ground in which one is not denied despite the critique. The laws are hearing a call, and they are in fact pointing in that direction, and we are responding constantly. In that respect then, we have to be able to take a step back, and we have to be able to think through. And Lene Rachel Anderson's book, Metamodernity, does this in a very important way, in that she emphasizes that creativity is really, or reconstruction, is the essence of metamodernity. How do you hear the call? How do you respond to that call? And how do you somehow find a way to affirm that the call that you hear doesn't technically exist? Your response to the call will fail to enact what it's calling, and yet nonetheless, what you are enacting and creating is necessary, that the thing that doesn't exist is in fact having an important pull on all of you and your decisions, and that this is a healthy process. How do you overcome the failure to enact the creation and the creativity? Now, that's the philosophical kind of background to kind of understand what I'm getting at in terms of how Derrida helps us to see a path for metamodernity and what we're really looking for in terms of creativity. Then there's another question. one that is, again, it's still getting speculative here. Okay, we can see the trajectory that we want in terms of what metamodernism could be, but then what does it look like? How might it look like? And moreover, for us, what does it look like for Christianity? Whether we like it or not, right? Christianity today is highly affected by postmodernism and will likely continue to be more and more, despite the fact that we're moving beyond it. That's always the way that everything, the church seems to always trail behind in just about everything, and no doubt with worldviews. But we're already affected by postmodernism in many ways. Even the people who think that they're modernists are already affected by it. So where and how will metamodernism affect the church? Well, as I said, there is no current metamodern theologians. There are, at least, that are espousing themselves as such, to my knowledge. There are no metamodern biblical studies, and it will affect it. It has to. Postmodernism has affected biblical studies in many ways, and other fields like theology. Metamodernism will too, inevitably, at some point, as new philosophers come and think through these things. And of course, this interests me because I'm doing my PhD. I'm thinking through, what does metamodernism look like in my field? Since so many people are doing postmodernism and it's obviously a part of the field, how is this going to affect other things? So I want to offer two possibilities, acknowledging that this probably isn't where the field will go, that this isn't necessarily, I can't predict, what metamodernism will look like. I can only participate and give you an insight into that development. But so take it or leave it. This is how I'm currently in the process of thinking through some ideas. So one of the ideas is postmodernism's main issue that gives us is the question of how can we talk about truth when we are also affirming that it doesn't exist in the way that we think about it traditionally, right? Which kind of translates to Derrida as well. How can we speak of the undeconstructible if it doesn't exist? How can we speak of a call if we can't say that the thing that's calling is even there? How do we speak of an approximation of something that's not even there for us to know if it's approximating it? These are questions inherent even in Derrida's own thesis. And yet, in many ways, I think there are chances to see how maybe metamodern approaches could change this. So here's one way that I would think of approaching the question of objective versus subjective truth. And of course, this is also part of, modernism. Modernism loves the categories of objective and subjective. It goes ahead and tells us that there are things that are objectively true, and there are things that are just subjectively true. They're just true for you. They're true in your head. Now, postmodernism has been used to come around and say that relativistically speaking, everything is, subjective. And because there's no real true objectivity, taken to its extreme, no true objectivity, really everything's relativized, or could be if you take it that far. And you just need to accept that and understand how the deconstruction process reveals that fact. Metamodernism might go something like this, imaginatively. Especially, I'm going to speak as a theologian, thinking in terms of God. If the universe, well, let me paraphrase this, preface this right quickly before, right? In modernism, we're used to hearing that phrase, a God's eye point of view, right? Oh yeah, we don't have a God's eye point of view, i.e. we don't have the truly objective view. God can see everything. God knows everything, but we don't have that. Okay, now, with that said, metamodernism would be like thinking through this quickly as, well, if we are all the result of God's subjectivity, God's inner desire, God's inner creativity, if God is love and love is inherently subjective, which I don't know anyone who argues it isn't, that love is inherently idealistic, inherently skewed to some degree towards the positive. If we are all, and the universe is the creation of God's subjectivity, then even God's point of view is subjective. But what that means is, it's not that everything's relativistic, but that in fact, we have made a mistake in some sense of thinking that the subjective is not objective. It is objectively true that in my experience, this tea is delicious. it is not necessarily true for your experience. But just because it's subjectively true does not mean it is not objectively true within my life experience. The truth is not any less objective because it's limited to my specific circumstances. My context makes this truth possible, and it is in fact true. But noticing that each person comes with their own list of contexts and circumstances means that the truth and what is objective is shaped differently depending on where they stand. It does not make it any less true. It does not make it any more relativistic, but it does in fact qualify that truth is contextual, that each truth is built on a series of predispositions and presuppositions. In the same way, one can argue that the universe and the truths that govern it, while technically for us we would perceive them as objective, are in a sense subjective because they stem from God's inner desire. So noticing first as a potential avenue, without giving you all the answers, that the dichotomy between objectivity and subjectivity can be shown to not necessarily be as strong as it was assumed by postmodernism, that in fact, or by modernism, I should say, that in fact, just because so much is subjective does not deny the objective, and that we can then actually speak of real truths that exist, not just in the mind, not just as a perspective someone holds, but as true contextually. Now, this is in fact some idea that has already been hinted at in the Bible. The Bible has times where Jesus will go ahead and talk about the idea that while that was true for that moment, it's not necessarily true at this time. Ellen White talks about this as well, and part of the idea of present truth. Something was true under certain circumstances. It's not that it was false and now we have a truth, but a truth at one point, like law, can fail, can be deconstructed, can in fact have circumstances change. It doesn't deny its objectiveness. It does deny its timelessness. So that's one perspective. Now, applying this, say, in another way, outside philosophy, theology, think about biblical studies, my field. In my field, it's becoming increasingly a process of going ahead and telling people over and over again through postmodern analysis that we cannot speak of an author's intention, that the idea of an author having an intention has been proven and demonstrated a faulty idea, that in fact, because of rhetorical criticism and the understanding of reader response, that the reader is as much involved in the creation of meaning as is the author, that in fact, some extremists would argue the text has no meaning until someone looks at it, until someone interacts with it. And yet, scholars, while holding these views, also hold that there are illegitimate ways of reading a text, seemingly in contradiction to their points, that there are ways in which the text should not be read that would be illegitimate and wrong. Now, one of the problems of biblical studies under modernism was that it assumed that every text had an intention, singular intention. What was the author trying to say, singular? What is this text being used for, singular? Like Hermann Gunkel and form criticism was always in this mode of thinking. Constantly, what is the single purpose this text held? But as we've learned through postmodernism, texts do not hold single meanings. I might write something and not even realize that the text can be read another way. In fact, I've had the experience of writing things that I then later read years later, and I see an entirely new thing in what I wrote. Despite the fact that I never intended it, it came from me, and I then adapt the new reading. In IE, it's a weird experience to read your own work and find something new in it that leads you to realize something about yourself that you didn't even know when you wrote it. You're learning from yourself. It's a weird thing. It's not like you wrote it with the intention of saying that, but now that you see it there, you own it. And it's like, there you go. So a text can have multiple intentions, both unconscious that emerge from within you and conscious. J.K. Rowling talks about this with her book series, Harry Potter, where she talks with Oprah Winfrey and said, I didn't know what I believed until I wrote this book series. Like I knew unconsciously my beliefs about life and death, good and evil, but it wasn't until I had to tell the story of Harry and how he dealt with Voldemort that I realized actually in how I told the story what my inner convictions were about these things. And so she learned about herself in the process of whatever her conscious intentions were. So there are multiple things that can be intended as well. A text might be intended on one level to read this way for one audience, another way for another audience. There are going to be multiple ways of reading something. But there's also going to be limits on what those intentions could have been, based on the fact that he's a human being, not a dog, based on the fact that the person writing is living in the 1st century, not the 22nd century, the fact that the individual is writing in Japan versus where he's writing in Berlin. There will be contexts that are going to make the amount of interpretations potentially limited, so that there are some which would just be wrong because it doesn't fit the contextual restraints, and some that there's a list of possibilities that could exist. Now, it's very easy to have J.K. Rowling or myself tell you what those are. But when you're dealing with an author from the ancient world, you don't get the ability to go back there and find out what ones were among the list of possibilities you could map out, the ones that they were conscious of and the ones they were unconscious of. And perhaps in some sense, that's what metamodernity could, or a metamodern analysis of biblical text could lead us to not speak anymore. I mean, we already don't speak of an author's intention, but maybe to speak of an author's possible intentions, or a possibility of intentions, the possibility of intentionality, to be able to point out that there are a number of possibilities that could be perceived in the text that the author, in fact, would have been having in his mind or her mind, even if we don't and cannot say for sure which are the ones that were intended consciously and which ones are a result of simply that individual's life, creative process, or culture. That humility of both accepting we don't have a single answer and could not, for the simple reason that human beings don't usually have one, but also recognizing that there is in fact limits. There are in fact a selection of texts one or interpretive choices one could choose from, could lead us to a place in which we are both humble and yet confident. Humble to know that history is faulty, confident to be able to say that, of course, Jesus was a historical figure, humble to know that a parable has many meanings, confident to know that there are some meanings that people propose that are just impossible given the restraints of interpretive possibility. So that would be, and again, free to disagree, please do. This is my perspective on my developing understanding of where a metamodern analysis might be leading us to hold in tension these differing points to allow us to be able to recognize that things can in fact still be tangible and true, despite the fact that they may also be very much contextual and subjectively understood and potentially, temporal. Now, I think at this point, given the fact this can't be a typical lecture, because this isn't something, that's like, hey, guess what? The experts say this. There's this guy who believes that. I think it might be better if Dr. Larson, asks me some questions for clarification he thinks that the class might have, and also opens this up to anyone else who might want more clarity. And just know that when you ask me something, you're probably making me think about it for the first time as well. And so you are, in fact, a part of this process of creating what will be the metamodern view, at least one part of it. So feel that you're just as equal in this conversation.
Thank you, Matthew. This has been very, very rich. I must say that this idea of the undestructible is brand new to me. I had not anticipated that at all. I started to read Derrida's essay last night, and I didn't get far enough into it, I guess, to get to the undestructible, because he spends a lot of time justifying what he's going to say before he starts to say it. But this idea of the undestructible is a fascinating one to me, methodologically, because what you're doing is going to postmodernism itself and finding within postmodernism the resources to move beyond it, instead of going to some other resource a kind of an extrinsic source. You're going to it as an intrinsic source to find within it resources for moving on. I'm surprised that, I guess I don't want to put it this way, but I'm surprised I didn't hear about this before. Why? How could I have been so deaf not to have heard about the undestructible until now? On the other hand, I think there may be quite a few people who haven't heard anything or maybe much at all about the undestructible. So I think my first question would be to ask you to revisit that notion of the undestructible and say whatever else comes to your mind about it, because that's key to everything else you've said, I do believe.
Definitely, right? Because the key for how Derrida could think about the undeconstructible is that in his mind, right, because it doesn't exist, it still falls under the rules of postmodernism. Because postmodernism is saying there is no major meta-narrative. There is no overall correct objective thing. And Derrida is kind of squeezing this in there by saying, yeah, you're right, but it doesn't exist. So that's why it doesn't fall into foul with the theory. We're not saying that God's the exception. We're pointing out that God is, or not, he's not specifically making it about God. That's more of Caputo's reading and adaptation of it. But there are things that do not exist, so they can in fact be a kind of eternal thing, since they don't actually exist within time and space. Yet we still somehow have an ideal or knowledge of them. We're somehow influenced by their call, and it's a call that draws us to constantly act in response. So that is something important, because it tells us that there is a place for God in postmodernism, not within a modern kind of new atheism, Ken Ham debate setting. We're not dealing with the idea of thinking about God in the sense of the highest being. We're thinking about God in the sense of something that's outside of being, more probably in the like of how Paul Tillich here talks about God as the ground of all being, or you know, the idea of Caputo talking about the unconditioned. We're talking about God as something so totally other, like Karl Barth talks about. We're talking about God as the thing that cannot be restrained within our time and space. And because he's not conditioned, not restrained by time and space, God is not under the rules of postmodernism in the sense of you can deconstruct it. You can't, because you can, it's like science. You can only do a scientific experiment on something that's in front of you, tangible, that you can test. You cannot deconstruct philosophically using postmodernism God or things that are like justice, because they don't exist. So that's kind of the element Derrida is going to. Now, the fact that you don't know about it is not surprising. Derrida was also, as I remember, upset that that idea never really was remembered too well by people who studied him. Caputo emphasizes it very strongly, which is why it's a good point to get his book, What Would Jesus Deconstruct, and to read Derrida's article. But ultimately, the undeconstructible was always a key idea for Derrida, not just in that article, but also just throughout his writings. This idea that there are things that cannot be deconstructed for the simple reason that they don't exist. So if they don't exist, we didn't make them. So in religious terms, you can't destroy an idol if it's not an idol, right? You can't kill God, but you can destroy an idol. And the idol might feel like it's God. It might look like it's God because you made it an idol. But if you were wise, you used postmodernism, you understood it was a created thing, you would not worry about it. You'd expect it to crush. You'd expect it to deconstruct because you understood its origin.
Okay, I have two other issues, then we'll take a break and see what others have to say. When he starts talking about something as important as justice, but it doesn't exist, my mind quickly goes to Platonic forms. The Platonic forms are actual. They are abstract summaries of pure potential. And so one might say a Platonic form does not exist in time space, but it is actual as a everlasting potential. And I just wondered to what degree he was consciously going to Plato on that, or to what degree I'm misunderstanding him. But when he starts talking about justice as being outside of time and place, nevertheless important, time and space, I should say, nevertheless important as a kind of lure or invitation or echo to which that which is concretely in time and space always approximates, never fully realizes it. Boy, that sounds like Plato to me. What do you think?
I think there's some significant differences
Okay.
that help to distinguish between these perspectives. Although I see where, and believe me, the forms have come to my mind as well. But some of the differences that could exist here, I think, is where Derrida is looking as saying, look, everyone who creates a law is intentionally trying to approximate justice. They're all in agreement on it. And they're trying to create something to approximate what they already think is there. Whereas like Plato, and mind you, keep this in mind too, Derrida doesn't think that justice exists. It literally does not exist. It's not there. The only reason we think of it is because of this haunt or this call that we're experiencing that is driving us to think that it's something needed that comes and rises within us. But then Plato's view would be more like, look at all the actual things that do exist, like called trees, and notice that they're all different. And really, they're all symbolic of what is the true tree somewhere in the land of ideals. And that true tree does exist, but it doesn't exist in materiality. That's evil. It exists in, it exists in the spiritual realm. It exists in the place where the true God would. It's in, the world of forms. So Plato really does think that these things exist. He just thinks they exist in sort of a spiritual state. And he thinks that everything that we tangibly see is an approximation of that thing. Whereas Derrida doesn't think that justice actually exists somewhere in any form. And he isn't trying to look at our current laws to figure out what justice is. Rather, he's just sort of presuming from the start that the reason we all have this innate desire to try and go ahead and create a law is driven by the need for justice. So you don't need to try to find examples of justice. You won't find any of them. Plato would not deny that there are trees. He'd just say they're deformed. Whereas Derrida would say there is no law that approximates justice, but every law is approximating it, is in an attempt to do this thing. So I think like there's some subtle nuances between the two views.
Okay, now I would pursue this further in a different context, but I would say that something that has no, let me just go to technical language really quick. Not something that has no ontological actuality cannot be a call, or cannot be an echo. Now, it's one thing to say that something exists, and another thing to say that something is actual. I think the forms are actual, but they don't exist. But anyway, that's an interesting discussion, I think, to have. I would
and keep in mind too, I might add too, where Derrida's coming from as well, right? Like I think many people classify Derrida as sort of atheistic in some sense. Derrida probably has a number of restraints that prevent him from affirming certain things or going in certain directions that, say, a Christian philosopher, Christian theologian might try to take the argument in. We haven't had enough Christian theologians who are interested in examining these things to kind of that don't buy into it wholesale or don't go into a strict postmodern theology that could try to expand and imagine the other interpretive possibilities. So the fact that you might see holes or imagine that I'm not comfortable, like that would be expected, I think, just by virtue of how little these ideas still need to be, interacted with and built upon.
Okay. Now, that's a whole nother issue. We could talk about the ways theologians have appropriated different schools of thought and made use of them. The Yale School of Theology really did a lot with Wittgenstein, for instance, in a generation before you did, producing people like Hauerwas and so forth. Put Wittgenstein and Barth together and you got a Hauerwas. So that's, I think, interesting. But I'd like to move to another question, and this one comes more from Caputo than it does from Derrida, and that is, when we talk about God as outside of time and space, that means God can be affected by neither. So you have here a very abstract view of God,
yes,
which is a God that has no interaction with humankind. And I want to say that that's a classical view of God. I mean, God is outside of time and space, and for most people over these centuries, God, there is no past, present, or future for God, but everything is one eternal now. All right, but that's exactly what Rick Rice is denying in his book. He is saying that God is open to changes in the concrete world, and those changes make a difference in God. So he's not going to be willing to say God is wholly outside of time and space. Now, I'm not trying to cast a vote here, although clearly my preference is for Rick's open view of God, but it does show that Caputo's is moving in a very traditional view of God, very traditional. But in that God is abstract, God is timeless, Aquinas could affirm that, Augustine could affirm that, but Rick Rice couldn't affirm that, nor Hartshorne, nor Whitehead, So there's a very, very different view of God. And I'm not sure we're making progress when we talk about God as wholly unaffected by time and space.
So I want to be, there's a point of clarification here in defense of Caputo. Caputo doesn't think God is a person.
Well, that's my point.
Right. So Caputo, but this is where it differs from like a classical theistic standpoint of God being outside time and space and so forth. Like he's not affirming that God is, he's not affirming that God is some, at least like in the Folly of God book, he's not trying to affirm, as far as I read it, that God is a person who's unaffected by space and time or has thoughts, or he really in the end tries to, in a sense, understand or redefine God as potentiality, as the future. Not as like eternal present or as a past or always true, but more like it's always the potentiality of whatever we don't know that's coming next. In some sense, if I had to use a Bible story to illustrate it, think of when we talked about way back Jacob wrestling with God at the Jabbok River. For Caputo, this would be my critique of, not a critique, but description in a negative sense of what I think this theology looks like. It's like Jacob wrestling with God at night. God is that potentiality that suddenly strikes him at night. It could curse him, could bless him, this potentiality, and that's all you can hope for. Like Caputo would end the story, in my opinion, like the way to be comical. He'd end the story before Jacob's like, I want my blessing, and the angel's like, okay, hear it. No, God is the potentiality that strikes you in the night. And that's what you get. It might end up with a blessing, but it won't be because you want it. It's just because that's how it could end up. So he tries, in a sense, to redefine understanding God as sort of what potentiality exists in the universe to be enacted. And then by understanding humanity as, like saying God does not exist, God insists, then we become the enaction for Caputo of God. We hear that call of the God that doesn't exist. And in fact, according to Caputo, we make God exist by our response to his call, becoming the hands and feet of God, doing the thing that he's calling for, gives this non-existent God the existence in through us in what we do. That's a sort of vision that comes out of Caputo for his postmodern theology. He's trying to keep wholly within that system. So I like, just in his defense, like he wouldn't share the presuppositions that Richard Rice does. He's not going to go that direction. He's going to be like, nah, that's antiquated. So they're going in directions that, again, like for me, that was a pretty depressing view at the end of the book. I mean, for me, I was like, I don't think that sounded very, very gospelish. I don't think that appealed very dramatically to me personally. But there are people who are very, into postmodernism, and for them, like, this is very helpful as a way of conceiving of God, because it helps bring this system into a more religious aspect.
Okay, I can think of theologians who think about God as potentiality, but I think let's put that aside and take a break and see what other people have to offer and question. This has been very, very rich for me, and I'm learning a lot. Thank you. Now, as I hope everybody can click on the participant icon at the bottom of your screen and look at the list of participants we have here, and just glance down them and one can see many, many names of people who have not yet had a chance to speak. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I'm looking at that list and I'm wondering if there are people there who would like to say something, but haven't had a chance to do so. No one should feel pressure to do so, but everyone should be invited to do so. And I think there's a tendency for some of us to speak quite often, but others to be somewhat retiring, and yet we have good things to offer. So I'm going to ask those of you who have not yet had a chance to speak up very much to indicate to Forrest whether you would like to this time around, and hopefully you'll come up to bat first. Then we'll hear from those who have spoken more often. That would be my first choice. Now, Matthew, you and me and Forrest need to try to accomplish something, and that is to keep each segment of interaction to about 6 minutes. So that means that the questioner has to be quite concise and the answer has to be quite concise, both. So if we can keep it about 6 minutes, then we can get quite a few people in. If we get, 8 or 9 minute speeches on either side of the question or the answer, we're going to be stuck. Anyway, thank you. This has been rich for me. And let's take a break. It's now 11:36 by my time, so that puts it at about 11:56, approximately 11:56 California time. We will see you then. Thank you, Matthew.
I was going to say, just raise your hand or wave your hand in the picture or something. I'll try to find you. Be patient with me. Sometimes I don't find them all. So,
Question,
Hank, you got a question? Okay.
is this a 20-minute break? I thought it was supposed to be 10 minutes.
Yeah, David,
Well, I never get it right.
46, right? You meant 11:46.
Yeah, I never get it right, Jeff. Thank you for being a scientist. So it's 11.
I'm glad to have contributed, yes.
11:46 or so, all right?
Sounds
Let's
good.
get something to nourish us.
Visible.
Henry?
Yeah.
You make a great view as you're walking along.
Oh.
And you got a beard now. I hadn't seen you with a beard. This is Donna.
Well, thank you. Hi, Donna. This started out as a Movember, growing a beard, not shaving for November, but I haven't taken it off yet.
This looks nice. Looks very distinguished.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it adds IQ points. Just.
Oh, good. Well, that's gonna make me loath to shave it off.
There you
I
go.
need it, especially as I get on in years, I need to get more points.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hank,
Yeah.
I grew my mustache in 2012 for Movember.
Oh.
Never shaved it off. My son was at Adventist, Glendale Adventist. They had a Movember fundraiser down there. So,
Well, the reason why I'm sure this has to go is that my wife can't bring herself to like it. So, that's a hard choice.
well, you have two choices, don't you?
I'm
Yeah.
sure, I know some of you know my father-in-law, who's passed away, Bruce Wilcox. I was with him on a number of occasions where he would comment on people's beards. He always had a beard. But for the young guys, he'd say, and it'll look even better when it has a little gray in it. So maybe that gray, as you
Yeah,
get more gray in
spend-
it adds additional IQ points.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Like that. Thank you. I'm going to hang on.
Hi, Forrest.
David,
Are you getting many volunteers?
well, I've got 3 so far.
Okay. I'm looking down the list here. In addition to you, we have Alicia. Well, she's from Portland, I think. Brian, Carol, she's from up in Washington, I do believe. David Johnson, we hear rarely from. Ed Turner, Gary, Henry Lamberton.
Yeah, he's on the list.
Okay, Gerald Whitehouse. I haven't heard from Gerald Whitehouse from a long time. We need to hear from him, particularly from a missiology and world religions point of view. I don't know if that's Melanie or Chris Job or somebody else. Melvin Douglas, we haven't heard from you for a long time. Ruth Christensen is brand new with us. And welcome, Ruth. Terrence Dunder. Clyde, or have you had a chance to speak anything? Clyde Rogenkamp. That would be wonderful to hear from others. Again, this is an invitation and not an obligation. There's a big, big difference between the two. So if you'd like to speak up, be sure to let Forrest know.
Ruth Christensen, did you get the emails this week?
Yeah, yes, I did. I
Good.
did. I was very happy.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I'd like to hear from Brian Bull.
And Brian probably saying, I came here to relax and now everybody's wanting to hear from me. I would like to hear from Brian too. I do think that this idea of being so hard, the postmodernists who, now not all postmodernists this way, but the postmodernists who deride science are not people whose views I favor. This vaccine we're coming up now is the result of the Enlightenment and the scientific method. And to diminish that kind of accomplishment, I think is disrespectful, and I think it's not wise. Anyway, is it time for us to begin?
I believe it is.
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay, over to you, Forrest.
Okay, well, again, I've got 4 on our list now. Feel free to raise your hand at any time, or you can wave your hand on the screen, or you can even send a message through the chat, and I look at that periodically. So I'm going to start out with Monty. You had a question you wanted to ask.
Yes, it's really just about the books. I was wondering, what was the name of the Metamodernism book again that you held up? Was it just Metamodernism?
It is Metamodernity altogether.
Modernity.
And it is by Anderson.
Anderson.
With an E at the Andersen.
Okay. And the concept of this undeconstructible.
Undeconstructible, yeah.
Is
perfect.
that from that book, or is that from What Would Jesus Deconstruct?
You'll see it in What Would Jesus Deconstruct, but it's basically it's a very common term that just Derrida employs for his deconstructionism. So you'll see it should pop up in any academic discussion, or certainly especially in Caputo's work, simply because of the fact that theologians who want to utilize this certainly see a lot of relevance for grabbing onto it for the concept of God. So you're going to see a lot of emphasis. I suspect Caputo's work in What Would Jesus Deconstruct mentions it a lot. It also talks about the Law and Order article, a Law and Justice article as well.
Okay,
it's a short book, honestly.
Okay, it's an interesting topic to me, and I also wonder about the linkages between the undeconstructible and Plato's forms. So it's going to be fun to explore those ideas. Anyway, thank you very much for your presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I want to preface as well, just again, I am not an expert in philosophy. I hold a bachelor's degree in it, but like, again, like that was while doing studies for 3 others. So I am probably have many, many holes in my thinking. So please, nobody ever quote me and be like, this is what's nice about metamodernism is that in terms of thinking of where it might go, my opinion can be just as good as anyone else's, including yours, because it doesn't exist yet. Oh, the undeconstructed. But I just want to clarify that. I'd hate, like, if I've misstated a view of Caputo or Derrida, and I don't think I have, but of course there's always the threat that I might have. If somebody knows that, please correct it or add a new perspective in there. Be very grateful for that.
Okay, I want to go now to Hank Lamberton.
Mine's what I'm going to say is more of a comment or a thought, or as is partly a question. I'm a psychologist, so when you talk about the God persisting and this being something that we're drawn to, I wonder how that would differ experientially. This is a subjective question by definition, but from Kant's The Moral Law Within, or what C.S. Lewis writes about more popularly about the moral law, where people feel this sense that they know when they're doing something wrong or tacky. That was where my mind was going as you were talking.
Yeah, I kind of have the idea of where you're thinking about that. I'm not sure what either Derrida or more specifically Caputo would be thinking about that. I know, for example, there's another theologian, a philosopher who got his PhD in postmodernism, Peter Rollins. He's from Ireland, a famous guy. He does a lot of psychoanalysis. So he does a lot of interaction with Lacan and so forth, and how that relates to theology. And I know, like, he wrote in his book, I think it was The Fidelity of Betrayal, he goes ahead and tries to write, he makes a counter argument, which is an interesting one. He argues that he tries to make an argument for the absence of God as proof that God is there. That the fact, it's not that you feel that God is present and you're reacting to it, but it's the fact that you feel this darkness, this doubt that lets you know there must have been something there. That this I'm misstating it. He calls it hyper. Oh, what is the way he refers to this? Hyper. It's like God's near you, but then it's like he makes this argument that God is so near that in fact screws up all our senses. So that in fact, the very fact that we have trouble sensing God is in fact the evidence that we're completely surrounded. It's a very interesting argument he makes for how the very essence of, like, your doubt as an atheist could in fact be the greatest evidence psychologically that you're experiencing something. Anyways, if you've not read it, Fidelity Betrayal, it's a great book, has lots of other interesting concepts. It's been too long since I read it.
Just one maybe follow-up expansion on that. If C.S. Lewis, he spends quite a bit of time in Mere Christianity arguing that there's this moral law and that it's not, and it's something that's transcultural, that you find it in some ways across culture. And if that's true, and I realize that's been debated, but if that's true, would that be some kind of evidence for this outside persistence? Is there some congruence there?
I mean, like, speaking not authoritatively, just, me speaking from my own point of view, I would think that it's hard to sometimes in my mind separate like two scenarios. One is God always pushing, and maybe this is part of the modernism, postmodernism trap. I don't have to maybe make it a dichotomy, but like, in some sense, that concern of, okay, well, is it that God creates us, and because we're children of God, we innately have so many of the characteristics and potentials and insistences that he's already hardwired into us that are slowly and and easily brought out through context over time? Or is it the case that God is feeding these things into our empty shells over time? You know, those two scenarios, it's hard. Maybe it's both. Maybe, you know, God puts the hardwire in there, but God is working to constantly bring it out. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So I do think, however, that another great book to read, if you haven't, this kind of touches, like your question in a sense, also ends up touching on issues of total depravity, original sin. How do people understand where human beings stand in relationship to God? And the ability we've had to access the divine. There's a great book to read by Danielle Schroyer. It's called Original Blessing. It's a really small, great book. I don't know if maybe you're nodding a lot, maybe you've read it. No, okay, but the title certainly rings a sort of, Original Blessing. It's got like, it's a white book with this golden snake that's trying to eat an apple on the front of it. But it's by Danielle Schroyer. It's a great book and kind of underscores all the themes that we've missed about how much God states throughout Scripture that we have intuitive moral knowledge, that he's given us this blessing that has been given and never denied to humanity. So it's a really important work in the sense that it balances out the necessary acknowledgement of structural inequalities and evils and sin, while at the same time recognizing that we are in fact still endowed with those things that God blessed us with. And so there's always going to be that tension there. And that's always been the Jewish perspective. I mean, Judaism never embraced the concept that that humanity was completely depraved. Their understanding was always that the people who worshiped idols had gone down a dark path and had given themselves over to depravity. Not that they were innately depraved and the Jews had somehow come out of it. The assumption from the Jewish narrative was that anyone else had just fallen away, not that humanity in its core had issues. And that's a view throughout the Hebrew Bible that's usually supported. So I definitely agree. Like, I think that there's from my perspective, I definitely think that the fact that we do find those moral links, the axial age phenomenon, all these issues, I think definitely point us towards the idea that there is evidence of some collective understanding, or I would say it this way, a collective trajectory, even if our collective specificity is not collective because it's so contextual to each time period we're in. But we all seem, especially in the axial age, to try to go in a similar direction.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to go to Terrence Dunder. Are you finished your lunch now?
Yeah, I am. Thank you.
Okay, all right, Terrence, thank you.
You got to watch me use my chopsticks. No, I had just a very simple question, and maybe it, I've been trying to come up with thoughts and ideas about how we might reconstruct our belief in God in a way that's more palatable to everyone. And I'm wondering, would it be true to state that God, our view of God is subjective and therefore deconstructible? And if so, how would we know what is foundational and not deconstructible? Is that individually determined?
So I really love your question. I didn't expect this, but this is perfect. So let me expand it a little and mention this. So think about, the way I would think about it is, when I talk to atheists or people are curious or agnostic and they're asking me about my beliefs about God, which has happened on a number of TikTok live sessions I've been doing. And one of the interesting things that has come out of that is discussing how there are certain things that perhaps they are deconstructible, but we don't have a means to do it. So in essence, in a sense, even if it was ontologically deconstructible, there is no ability to really do it. So for example, relationships, right? Your relationship with your spouse is not quantifiable or deconstructible to single elements once it forms. When you're beginning your dating process, you might be able to quantify certain elements and be able to say that this is standing out, but by the point in time you've reached, they're in happy, wedded perfection, love, happiness, honeymoon, whatever, you try to ask the person, hey, why do you love your wife? Why do you love your husband? If they start to say, well, she cooks, well, he wears things nice, right? Immediately, a shared collective response is this person doesn't understand what the question was. Right? There's only a few select answers that are acceptable to give that would indicate you understand the question. If you began to quantify things, it would seem to suggest to most people you don't actually know what love is, or you don't really love this person. Because in a sense, love is understood to be like numerous wires that are all intertwining together to form a rope. And by the time that this rope of 1,000,000 wires forms, you can't tell all the wires anymore, and you can't specify them out. You just have this rope. Now, the problem becomes that the rope is something only you see. It's not something that you can actually show. You can't grab it and say, here, see, it's proof. You can only espouse to someone, I know my spouse, they're amazing. I know my spouse, they wouldn't do this. I know my spouse, right? But you don't have a proof for that. It's a subjective experience that's objectively true. It is objectively true that there are these two partners and they share this combined, but you can't prove it. The two partners might know it in their relationship, but they can't demonstrate it in a scientific way. You can't prove that your mother has not been lying to you for the past 18 years and is going to kill you on your 18th birthday. There's no way to prove that. You could hypothetically deal with plausibility and possibility and factors, but you again, the conviction that you know your mother so well that you know that this is impossible for her is not quantifiable in a scientific sense. And so as a result, even if it is in the highest God's eye view, potentially you could deconstruct all those wires. Even the person in love cannot do that themselves. And so in essence, you could say that maybe this is a good way of understanding the relationship of the divine to humans and how we talk about the existence of God. We talk about, pretty much since the axial age mainly, about the relationship and the way we're thinking of God in relationship to humanity. If we think about it in the sense of relationships can't be quantified, and we're defining God as love, and love is an emotion that's subjective and it's in relationship, well, then you're dealing with an issue that probably can't be proven. Maybe you can talk about plausibility and possibility in relationship to God, but as soon as you get to like some ontological, let's get to the nitty gritty, you're dealing with relationships. And if we can't do it with ourselves, why could we do it with God? That would be sort of my perspective.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of what I read in the Tao Te Ching, because in there, anything that you think you know can't be the way. The way cannot be defined because it is unknowable, but yet it exists in reality. But when we try to define it, we freeze it in space in a way that is deconstructible, I think is how that would be kind of converted his thoughts to postmodernism or metamodernism. Okay, good.
I agree.
Thank you.
Okay,
Mark,
Alicia.
may I interrupt just a second?
Please, David.
I'm
Please.
sorry. Can we ask Matthew to define axial age for us really quickly?
Sure. The axial age is a period of time around 500 BCE, stretches for several hundred years in both directions, in which you have this kind of, it's a way of classifying it. Different scholars disagree to a degree on how precise it is, but it's a way of kind of classifying a period of time in which many of the world's great religions begin to form, and there's new ideas of shared morality and collective beliefs about kindness and social structure, things that seem to move from a ritualistic kind of understanding as it's classically described to a more relational kind of point of view with the divine. And it occurs within this period of time for so many different religions that it begins to be viewed as sort of this new age of religious thought and expression that keeps blossoming forward. That's my cheap Wikipedia answer.
Okay.
Thank
That's your
you,
story.
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Alicia.
Yes, this is Alicia, and I want to thank Dr. Larson for calling out the people who don't often comment. And the reason I don't often comment is because I'm reticent to show how much I don't know about the topics often. But
I sympathize.
Despite that, I really appreciate what you're doing here at the Sabbath School, and it always makes me think, and I appreciate that so much. So today is no exception. I know very little about philosophy. I've tried to understand it some, but it's hard. So I'll just ask a question more on a personal level. How did you decide that that was something that you wanted to study for your bachelor's degree? How did you get into philosophy? What inspires you about it?
No, that's great. Okay, so this is fun. I don't know if I've ever said this before. So anyways, so at La Sierra, I came in wanting to do 3 majors. Well, first, when I came in, I knew that I wanted to do religious studies. And then I saw that they had the archaeology program. Now, the archaeology program, half of its credits are taken up from religious studies. So basically, it was like a 1.5 degrees. So I was like, hey, I get to travel to Jordan and go do, you know, archaeological digs, and it's only like I'm doing a minor on top. All right, I'm going to do that. So I knew that coming in. And then like within my first week, I found out that they had a film program, and I was like, oh, okay, like that's fantastic. I've loved creativity and writing and stories. And so I was like, all right, but wait, that's crazy. 3 degrees, you know, could I do that? And then Rodney Vance talked me into it, who's I think still running the film department, is running the film department still. And he went ahead and was like, well, I did my bachelor's and my master's and my further work, all in these fields. Sure, you could do them all at once. You know, I had to keep progressing from one to the other, but you just do it all at once. So with his blessing, I felt confident to try. It was about halfway or almost halfway through or over halfway through the program, because I knew it was going to take 5 years to do the 3 degrees. And I realized that they had, okay, the funny story is there was a mistake at the film department. They had issued out their the academic like program that requires you to do what classes, and they required you to take logic. Now, the professors at the film department assumed that this would be philosophical logic, like let's discuss things and how to do critical thinking, because they wanted their film majors, who typically didn't have background in this, to be able to think critically about, you know, their stories. And well, unfortunately, it wasn't critical thinking. It was formal logic. So instead, every student in that class, over half the class, was film majors who were suddenly faced with zeros and ones and being told that they were going to be doing World I, World II, and oh my goodness. So they were just learning equations. Anyways, there was a revolt at the film department over it. And anyways, they tried to change things up, but you know, again, like there was no ability to fix things for the most part. So I put my whole thing into it, and I was able to I was like in the top 3 of the class. There were some really talented students, but I just threw myself into logic. And there was this computer program the teacher had us doing constantly. It was fun. I can barely remember now all the equations, but it was really a fun, weird game. And then what ended up happening is, like, after that occurred, I'm thinking, well, that's a really weird elective I was forced to take. And I didn't want to change the program after they changed it, because it's like, well, I already did the class. Why am I going to make it just at least it counts for my film degree. But then I realized that La Sierra had an independent philosophy major, a degree that you could follow. And logic was one of the core classes. So I'm like, wait a minute, I have to be here 5th year. I already spent most of my time doing schoolwork. And all I need, because you could choose the electives. So I had all these many electives from all of these other courses that I was doing. So all I needed to do really was take the core courses that I didn't have in philosophy, and then I could mix and match together different elective classes. And I had to do a petition, and it went through, and they were like, they were sketchy. They're like, really, 4 degrees? I don't know any student who, I think they said they knew one student in their history that they could remember who did something crazy like this. But anyways, so that's what happened. And so then I was studying with Gary Chartier and studying with Maury Jackson and Fritz Guy and doing philosophy. And it worked, thanks to, weirdly enough, the fact that I was doing all those other classes. But that is how I ended up graduating with 4 degrees in 5 years, and why the US government had to actually request La Sierra to explain. They had told La Sierra, in a sense, like one of those messages where they're like, hey, this kid is obviously failing school. He's been going ahead and taking grant credits for well over the normal amount. He must be repeating classes left and right. So they had to explain, no, he's not repeating classes. He's just got too many degrees to finish. So anyways, that was, I always thought, a funny moment. They had to do the opposite of what Norma would be doing. No, keep sending the money to him for the grant, because he's just been doing too much work.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That was very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I want to go to, I just want to see if there's anybody else who has not asked a question for a while that would like to, or make a comment. I'm open to that. I have a couple names here that I'm ready to go to, but I'm watching, so.
I thought I saw Gerald Whitehouse. Did I make a mistake on that?
Oh, okay. Gerald, you go ahead, because.
Thanks, Forrest and Dave, for this opportunity. I'm using my wife's computer. That's why her name's under my picture here. Yeah, I appreciate the discussion today, although it's certainly not my particular area of forte or expertise, but I would like to comment and kind of ask a question at the same time. Appreciate, Matthew, the work you're doing. I see huge implications of this for how we do theology in a cross-cultural, global context. I mean, in the many different contexts that we have internationally. And with my work in mission, it's been a real concern to me of how do we encourage local theologizing. In other words, if theology is I think too often we've sort of assumed that theology as done here in the West is ultimate truth. And I think ultimate truth is in that realm that you're talking about of justice and so forth, that is in the undeconstructible. And that theology is an approximation, wherever theology is done, is an approximation of ultimate truth about God. But the implications missiologically, we have in our mission, basically, we have exported Western theological constructs across different cultures internationally, expecting that they would be as equally effective and as equally understood and helpful. And I have worked in a context where that simply is not true. And we've struggled to say, how do we reconstruct theology in a new context, in a non-Christian background context that is more meaningful, but yet is faithful to that undeconstructible truth. So that's my comment, and it really is a form of a question to you. I guess one aspect would be, how do we train theologians in Michigan for doing theology in a different context when you know, if our Western theological construct, if that's the way we're teaching, is simply an approximation of ultimate truth, which I believe is the case, then we want to train somebody for doing that kind of theology in an African context, an Asian context, or whatever. Anyway, I think you realize the implications there and the question involved. Thanks.
No, thank you. That's a great question. It's probably a question that goes well beyond what I myself tend to study and specialize in, but it's also a question that has haunted me. And I know it's very relevant, and it's something that not enough people are thinking about, which is how do you value theological truths that you hold to, or approximations you believe are valid? And at the same time, how do you encourage other communities in other locations and contexts to think through a new way to understand it that makes sense to them, but very well may also come out in a way that challenges the original view you yourself are trying to inform them of. And it's that uncomfortable nature of the ideas going in directions other than what you already are comfortable with and are trying to spread that can sometimes cause this tension. And I don't have an answer for it. But I do think that metamodernism is probably going to provide, whether we know it yet or not, this kind of approach for recreation and trying to find creativity is going to help us to think through these issues in ways that are better. I agree that I think theology can be understood as approximation. I think in some sense too, we see this in regards to, even within Israelite culture, when you think about Jesus and how he handles the law. I know we didn't get to that yet in the discussion about my book. We didn't really get to talk about Jesus and too much about the way that he did his hermeneutics. But it's interesting to note that Jesus's hermeneutics were never interested in a specific image or a specific way of thinking about something. It was always very focused on principle. It was always very focused on the root of something. And so, if you're always focused on the root, you can allow the flowers to bloom however they want to, if you think that the root of it is correct and healthy. And I think that in that sense, some of the issues perhaps in regards to mission work and spreading theology is helping to ensure that the roots are right and ripe to grow a new kind of vision of what's happening in another culture. Knowing, that the character of God is understood, that this is one thing where I would disagree. Like, what I'm uncomfortable with Caputo is he leaves you kind of wondering if it's ever possible to know what the character of God could be. And I think that as Christians, that can't be something we doubt. The character of God has to be our anchor, has to be a stability, has to be something we understand and can logically defend and know. And from that root, everything else should follow as it needs to, given a culture's context, and will show up healthy for doing so. It might look different, it might be expressed differently, but if the root is healthy, then whatever forms will just be a beautiful new artistic expression. On the other hand, I have seen plenty from Adventism of Adventist missionaries who early on went out to Eastern Europe to spread their ideas about what Adventism should be, which were very fundamentalist. And the church communities I now see in those places that I've been exposed to make fundamentalists in America look ridiculous. They're doing things that sound extremely Catholic while being ironically anti-Catholic to their core. You can see that the root they were given of a vision of Adventism was so corrupted, so skewed from what we actually were trying to approximate about God's character, that the end result is that the church doesn't even look Christian and doesn't even look Christ-like in the specific examples I'm thinking of. Individual churches, not denominations, not conferences. I'm thinking of individual churches I know, but whose theology they firmly believe. They think that they're the true church. They got their theology from the right missionaries, and it just shows that the root has to be our focus. If we don't have the character of God right, everything else is going to grow out either artistically beautiful and different and variant like creation, or skewed and deformed like after Eden.
Well said, Matthew. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Before we go to another questioner, Melvin Douglas has been giving links to some of the books that Matthew's been talking about in the share. No, not share. I mean the chat link. So Take a look
Yeah.
there. He gives you links on those books.
Terrence's recommendation on The Great Transformation by Karen Armstrong is a pretty classic traditional work on the axial age, popular work.
Okay.
Good way to
All
get
right.
your feet wet.
Okay. All right. Now, Elmer has had a question coming up. He's not there, is he, Dorothy?
I have a question from Facebook. Is that okay?
Sure. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, this one's from Hugo Jinche. He's actually got two. One of them is whether Matthew would be willing to revisit this question of authorial intent. And the view we have typically had that we should discern that as well as we can. We know we can't do it perfectly, but we should try to discern as well as we can what the author intended before we try to relate what the author has to say to us today. That's one thing. The other thing Hugo would like to know about is the approximation of justice over time. And isn't it the case that what seems to be just in some circumstances has not seemed to be just in other circumstances, and therefore there's a kind of journey that might need to take place?
Okay, no, those are two great questions. All right, so like, let me tackle the second one first, just because that was the freshest. So like in terms of approximation, right, that was part of Derrida's idea, which is the fact that a law is not justice, which is why its approximation of it is always going to fail. It's always going to be deconstructible. So Derrida acknowledged that as the evidence for recognizing that whenever you mistakenly think that your laws are justice, you become authoritarian and you create idols that eventually are going to be destroyed, inevitably, just due to the nature of reality. But on the other hand, we can also say too that there is this sense that there is something which should be just, that there is a right that needs to be approximated, must be sought after, must be found and approximated. And so the fact that that is there guiding, it's like you might not have all the antivirus software updates, to go back in the day, that you're supposed to be having downloaded with Norton. Oh man, I'm going back to my old childhood here. But nonetheless, you do know there's viruses. You don't know what they are. You're not sure how you can protect yourself, but you do know they're there and you're supposed to protect yourself from them. So you know that you're supposed to keep looking out for them, even if you don't have the list needed to root out each one, and maybe not even enough in order to do any specific defense work. So in some sense, just knowing that in some sense you're supposed to seek after justice and try is perhaps the most important element, whether or not the end result that you do comes out to effectively approximate it. It's that path, or as some people would like to say, it's the journey that matters more than the destination. The fact that you're walking can sometimes be the most important element. The fact that you're seeking justice can be the most important element, because if you're not seeking it, then it will definitely not come to existence. It will not have even an approximation. So that would be the first, to answer a second question. The first one that he asked, can you remind me? It had to do with authorial intent, right? Go back to that. So I agree. I mean, I'm a biblical scholar and I'm one who loves historical criticism. So I think that trying to understand an author's series of possible intentions are really important, because again, you don't want to illegitimately think through possible meanings, unless of course, right? Like, I'm not saying whatever you come up with has to agree. I think, so let's think of it two ways. There's two possible ways of interpreting a text. One is I'm going to look to find out what the text says, and when I see its authorial meaning and possible intentions, I am going to believe that those intentions are positive and potential for us. And now I'm going to try to adjust those intentions theologically, going from biblical studies now to theology. I'm going to try to apply them in new ways that expand into a new context. So Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 7 when he's trying to understand the relationship of the historical Jesus and what the historical Jesus taught about divorce versus what the Spirit of Christ is leading his church to understand about divorce in a new Greco-Roman context. And, he tells his congregation, you are not bound to the teachings of Jesus in their literal sense as given to the Jews in that context. If, in fact, by doing so in this Greco-Roman context, you actually violate the intentions and principles that underlined what Jesus's rules were supposed to deliver. So there is that sense, that route of understanding the Bible in which you want those authorial intentions because you want to kind of give them new life in the current context. On the other hand, right, you might not care about the authorial intentions. You might subvert them. So you might look at the book of Nehemiah and you might realize, as I talk about in my book, and I mean, it was only briefly, but for instance, Nehemiah is by the book's own logic, Nehemiah says that he's against all the prophets in Jerusalem that exist in his day. But we also know that he's against Zechariah. Zechariah had a vision in which he was told, do not rebuild the wall. We also see in Micah that there is a prophecy about not rebuilding the walls. The walls will be rebuilt when God comes back. Nehemiah, who's not a prophet according to the book and not a priest, just a politician governor who was serving as someone who was felt inspired to lead his people, he decides that his ideas are better than everyone else, and he writes a book about it. Now, using canonical criticism and understanding how all the books of the Bible relate together, right? I might I have the ability to read Zechariah and choose to read against Nehemiah's intentions. Nehemiah wants to defend why he's right to rebuild the wall. But I can read Zechariah and read about the prophets in Jerusalem that Nehemiah is criticizing, and I can associate myself with them and read against Nehemiah's defense to critique him and see him as an example of a tragedy. So there are two ways one could read any biblical text. You can read in favor of what the author is doing and to better understand him and appreciate him. But you can also read in order to understand what they're saying and then subvert it to say, I disagree with that. That's not the way that it should be done. And look, I have, like in canonical criticism, other texts of the canon that I can turn to recognize how they interact. So noting those two approaches, right, in terms of authorial intention, I think no matter what, it matters that we understand some sort of anchor, even if we're going to agree with it or disagree with it. We need to know what we don't want to just be like, well, the text could be understood this way, and so then now I disagree with that. Okay, you do, but it is way deeper and more rich, I think, if you're able to see that a text has some sort of potential intention and to then know whether or not you find yourself in agreement or disagreement with it. At least I do, as like a wannabe historian, I like this. I think one, great way of doing that sometimes is to pay attention to phenomenon, right? Like, I mean, take for instance, an issue I've been dealing with recently a lot. I know I'm stretching the time, I'm sorry. But one example of this would be Leviticus 18:22. So this is, famous clobber text against LGBTQ people. Just, take a really close look at that text and think deeply about what that text is actually saying. What does it literally say? That would be the first step. Like, just what does the text actual words read there? By the way, this is a fun thing. Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, when he's talking about the Good Samaritan, he asks the lawyer, what do you read? What is written there? And what do you read there? He asks both questions, and it's very interesting. Like, why specify two different questions? But there's this distinction: what's written and how do you interpret? What is there and how do you enlarge it or understand it and apply it? So in the Leviticus text, you can look at and see, okay, the text literally says man sleeps with man. Now, what a lot of people do, abomination, abhorrent, blah, blah, blah. What a lot of people will do with that text, especially evangelicals, is that they will read that text and then they will say to themselves, well, by logical implication, if God's against one gender doing something, it must be against both genders. And so then immediately the text is understood, implied, interpreted to mean it's talking about homosexuality. The other thing that they interpret, strangely enough, is, oh, well, if the text talks about a sex act, then it must mean that it's talking about anything associated with a sex act. So again, two things that are done in that interpretation immediately is assume extra things to the text, both in terms of intentions about gender and intentions about sexuality. Now, however, that would be a pretty anachronistic way of reading it potentially, because again, if you're ignoring the fact that text only talks about men, and you're ignoring the fact that the text only talks about a specific sexual act of intercourse. So it's ignoring a whole lot of other things it could have mentioned. But again, why would this matter? Well, this is where I think authorial intention or the possibilities of it are really helpful. If you look at Leviticus, Leviticus is a unique book in that it is primarily oriented towards male readers. And it assumes largely that the readers who will be enacting these things are men, and that there are certain times where rules will apply to women, and it does take time to explain when those are. So you'll have verses that follow a rule about men, and the Leviticus text will follow with, and this is how it applies to women. So you see this phenomenon, and you start to go, oh, okay, that's helpful to understand, because now I can realize that certain rules that apply to men or apply to women, they get that special treatment. Leviticus 18 doesn't. Oh, well, that goes against the style of the book. So if I'm honoring what I can perceive as historical intention of the book, then I shouldn't be expanding this rule to women, because the book would have done that if it was considered an important point. But it doesn't, which means I should honor the fact that it's discriminating specifically against men only. Second of all, I shouldn't assume that same point for the fact that it's in a polygamous culture. And the fact that Leviticus actually has a rule that states that you cannot marry a mother and her daughter at the same time. You can't marry both of them. Why? Because the author implies, the implied understanding is that this is going to create incest. How does it create incest? Well, let your imagination fill in. A polygamous marriage, a shared marriage bed, how could it potentially in legal restraints cause incest? So again, if that already tells you something about the culture, that there's a possibility the writer recognizes legally could occur, again, you're reading Leviticus 18, you go, oh, it doesn't make sense historically why this would have applied to women. There's actually historical reasons why it wouldn't have applied to women. And the book itself would have specified if it was. Again, I don't have to get into the mind of the writer to do anything. I don't have to go into a subjectivity. All I need to do is recognize hints of the possibilities of what this author's intentions could have been. And then I'm able to actually recognize that it would be incorrect to expand the text as many evangelicals do. Now, what you do with that, I'm not telling you. I'm just saying from a biblical study standpoint, how you read the text faithfully to understand what it might be potentially telling you, that would be the way you want to do it. So yes, authorial intention matters, but you got to be humble about how much you can get from this. How much should you be claiming for it?
Okay, thank you very much. It turns out Hugo's been working on those texts, so that's good.
Okay, I have two more. Elmer, you were commenting in the chat. Did you want to discuss that to Matthew or to the group as a whole? And then I'm going to go to Rodney. No? Go ahead, Elmer.
Couple of observations.
You're breaking up on us.
Can you hear me?
No,
Can you hear me?
not well.
It's kind of, Elmer, if you can hear me, it's kind of like, can you hear me? That's kind of how you're coming out. Like a robot.
Sorry.
Maybe if you turn your video off, Elmer, the audio portion will work better.
Okay.
Chromebook here, so it's not the best microphone. But if you could hear me,
I think the internet connection, Elmer,
Yeah.
on your end is
How's
pretty bad.
that?
Maybe.
Am I better?
Oh, okay. Wait, I heard that good. Yeah, I think you're doing better.
No.
No.
You couldn't hear me, I'll just pass.
I can't.
Okay.
Let me go to the chat and pull that up.
Yeah.
I'll pass.
Let me go. Why don't, okay. Elmer Capino, truth is structures of the mind that is shared by same species. It cannot be influenced by personal experience. Is that right?
I think, so, I mean, if I was to comment on that, I wish you could expand it more, but given the internet issues, it's understandable you can't. I guess for me, it depends on like what truth you're speaking of. You know, different truths might very well be very tied to personal experience, but there might very well be other truths, right, that have nothing to do with it. You know, when the truth is, when you leave the Earth's atmosphere, there's no error in space, and that will not change based on personal experience. On the other hand, you know, the truth of whether or not you experience love from your wife is a truth, objective reality, which you will experience distinctly different, depending on context and personal experience. So I think that depending on the truth you're speaking of and the kind of context will depend and change what Elmer is describing.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that, Elmer.
Yes.
Okay. Not working. I want to go. Rodney, did you have a question? I think this will be our last question, David.
I can still hear Elmer. Who isn't muted?
I'm gonna.
Is it Krogan comp?
No, Rod.
Oh, there's another Elmer that isn't muted. There's two. Oh wait, no, that isn't.
Okay, it's just. Yeah, it's Elmer Chinnick. That's another one. Anyway, Rodney, try it. Let's go to Rodney.
I'm still talking over somebody, aren't I?
Well, we're trying to find out.
Can you just mute everybody for us and then unmute Court?
That's what I'm going to try to do here.
You know what? He is muted, but for some reason we're still getting signal that comes through. If you look at it, he's muted.
No matter how hard we fight the Holy Spirit, it is still trying to reach us.
So I'm wondering, I'm just gonna remove them. And then maybe we'll hang on to the other Elmer.
Yeah.
That's quiet, I think.
Sorry about that. That was a very dictatorial move on my part.
I'll be quick because my question has been partly answered in your response, Matthew, to Gerald Whitehouse. I was down that same road. But many rabbinical and Islamic theologians and scholars, when they speak of God, they use words like God is incomprehensible, inscrutable, undefinable. To me, these are synonyms for saying he is undeconstructible. So I'm positing that from the very beginning of religion, the main religions, Islam, Judaism, God was undestructible. They all begin with God is, and they admonish their believers not to go backwards and deconstruct God. So in fact, Islam, it is blasphemy, I understand, to try and to deconstruct God. He is undeconstructible. And so, yes, that is a problem from the point of view of mission outreach. But my point being is that most of the world out there, when you take a look at their religions, they begin with God is, and that becomes an issue. But I thought your answer to Gerald was very good in that it's very important for us to get the character of God right, given that situation where most, maybe not most, but many God believers in other religions believe that he is inscrutable, incomprehensible, and undefinable.
And you know, it's not just other religions. I mean, in Christianity, there's been a long tradition of apophatic theology. The idea that you know, it's by saying what God isn't that you can say anything about God. Like, we can't really describe God, but we can say what he isn't. And I'm not I know a lot of fellow theologians who love apophatic theology. I appreciate it, but I'm not the biggest fan of it entirely, because in some sense, it's not entirely, like, sometimes apophatic theologians, I think, miss like implication as a logical rule. Like, for instance, if I say I love you, it's like I'm saying two things at once. I'm saying both I love you and I don't hate you. I didn't have to say the I don't hate you part, because it's implied in the fact that I'm negating what that statement would have meant. But in some sense, I think the apophatic theologians forget that every time they say God isn't something, they are in fact actually affirming God is something, because they've ruled out something God can't be. So while you can't say, if you tell them like God is not hate, it doesn't automatically mean God is love, but it does mean God is the opposite of what would hate be. God goes in a different trajectory from that direction if you're ruling out one. So, you know, it's kind of misguided, I've found, sometimes for different people to assume that they're really being apophatic by saying, well, God is not this, God is not this. It's like, yes, but you are in fact saying, without saying it, a number of things that you've not considered the ramifications of. So logically, there are things that I problem sometimes with, like very hardcore apophatic approaches. On the other hand, I think that in relationship to you know, Islam, some of the danger that comes from having a theology of God can be divine command theory, or the concept that if God says it, that's what makes it moral. And so there is no objective morality. It is arbitrary for us insofar as it is merely whatever God says and does. And this can lead to some very dramatically dangerous positions. You know, in Judaism, in the Bible, this is not the view. As you know, I did a previous lesson on trying to explore that. And you know, one of the things you learn from that is to understand that in Judaism, God's character is what stands as eternal and as an anchor. God will not contradict himself. The Bible, you know, over and over again affirms God is non-contradictory. He's not the author of confusion. God is non-deceptive, like he wants you to believe something different. And God is the author of sense. God creates the universe as it is. So when you take those things into consideration, then you know, it makes sense why, if God promises Jacob he'll be a blessing to him and God comes like a seeming curse, why Jacob says, I want my blessing. He's not, you know, pushing for something new. He's affirming, I want what was promised. When Moses says, you can't do this act you've said you're going to do because it would be evil, you would contradict your promises. Again, it's very much rooted in this. On the other hand, Islam, at least as I understand it, and I'm no expert, but they have this idea of abrogation, which is an interesting concept, but it works opposite of the way that Judaism constructed it, to what I understand. And it's basically the idea of if Allah says one thing in one part of the Quran, but then later on in the Quran, it looks like Allah has gone ahead and said opposite, right? Or different. Chronologically, it's the next one that would be the correct one. In other words, God is divine command. And you do understand that even if God said one thing at one point, if he contradicts it and it came chronologically as a revelation later than the other thing, then according to the rules of abrogation, God has abrogated or removed his previous statement and now believes the thing and is affirming the thing stated later. So this is one way in which, for example, radical Islamicists will use this principle to try and make the most radical interpretations of the Quran possible by arguing or convincing believers that actually the verses in the Quran that are peaceful come earlier, and the more violent passages come later, and thus that's God's will, not the other one. And that approach, again, you can see has terrible ramifications. So I think it's important. And again, lots of people interpret the Quran in many different ways. So that's not the correct way to interpret the Quran. That's not the only way. There's progressive Muslims. There's lots of approaches towards reading the Quran. And my point is simply that it does deeply matter that we can say God is something. If we cannot say God is love, if we cannot affirm what the character of God is, as you were pointing out at the end there, we can go down many dangerous roads in the discussion about the divine and what our responsibilities are.
Yep. I like your answer, but it does make a mission outreach very difficult, as Gerald was pointing out.
Yeah, it is. And you know, like I've never spent too long on missiology or trying to think through outreach, despite the fact that I feel it is a deep need. It's just, it's one of those things that I hope that there are people, and I pray that there are people who are trying to take the best of these insights and are working on it.
Okay, Matthew, thank you very much. David, before I turn it over to you, just want to remind the class that if you go to the chat, our bibliographer, Ed Turner, no, I'm sorry, no, not Ed.
Melvin
has been listing several of the books, and I appreciate that very much. So, David, to you.
Thank you, Forrest, and thank you all for a wonderful discussion. We will continue this theme of postmodernism through January, but the beginning of February we'll move in a different direction, and Matthew will help us in that with the second part of his book. I see Ed Turner still here, and I'd like to ask Ed what the internet address is for Restore a Child, because I haven't been able to find it here on the pamphlet. So if I wanted to go to Restore a Child on the internet, where would I go?
www.restoreachild.org.
Okay, restoreachild.org. I'm hoping that a number of people will visit that website between now and next week, because we will have Norma Nashad, who is from this Restore a Child endeavor, and she will talk to us about that. It's very, very dramatic. I'm thinking that Ed Turner will be here as well, and that Bill Johnson, who wrote the book about her, will be as well. We did see a notice about the movie that's been made or is being made about her, so that's coming along as well too. So
yeah, Matthew's mentor is the screenwriter and producer for it.
Oh,
Rodney Vance.
So things come around in a circle. Very good. So Norma will be with us, and then we are going to, somewhere along the line here, have a business meeting. We are not in trouble financially. In fact, we need to make some decisions about how we can share our resources with other people in need. And I'd like to get some counsel from Reinder Brunsma, and can do that this week. And so sort of keep alert as to when we might get together to talk about these things. So I think what's going to happen is that Forrest and I will bring a proposal as to what philanthropic opportunities we could support this time around. But very clearly, Restore a Child is going to be them at the very top of the list and probably get the most of what we can share. Anything else for us, or Ed, or anybody?
No, I think we're okay, and I want to thank you, Matthew, again, because what is this called? Modernism?
Yeah.
The new topic for me, so I've got a lot of stuff written down here, but someday we can talk about it. But thank you very much for that topic.
And thank you so much for bringing me and giving me a space to have a conversation with everyone here. Honestly, it's always the greatest pleasure to come.
Thank you. Here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.
I just want to say thank you to all of you folks and that I've been able to join you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. It's good to have you on board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Larson.
Thank you. We'll see you in February, if not before.
All right.